January 10th, 1945, 15:43 hours. Inside the Sherman tank, Fury Road, 3 miles east of Houffalize, First Lieutenant David Hayes felt the Panzerfaust impact before he heard it. The German anti-tank rocket punched through the Sherman's thin side armor like paper, sending a jet of superheated metal screaming through the crew compartment. The round missed the ammunition storage by 18 inches, close enough to ignite hydraulic fluid that sprayed across the turret interior like napalm. Hayes had 90 seconds, maybe less, before the fire reached the 75mm shells stacked beside the main gun. When that happened, Fury Road would detonate with enough force to turn 5 men into unidentifiable fragments scattered across frozen Belgian mud. He'd seen it happen to other Shermans. Tankers called them Ronson's lighters that ignited every time. Now Hayes was inside one, watching orange flames crawl toward ammunition that would kill everyone aboard. His crew was screaming. Not in panic. These men had been with him since Fort Knox, had survived 6 months of combat across France and Belgium. They were screaming because they understood exactly what was about to happen and were trying to extinguish flames with fire blankets that were already burning. Driver Rodriguez, gunner Miller, loader Chen, radio operator Walsh. 4 men Hayes had trained, protected, kept alive through impossible odds. 4 men who would die in the next 60 seconds unless Hayes did something they would never forgive him for. "Bail out!" Hayes shouted over the roar of flames. "Everybody out! Now!" Nobody moved. Miller kept fighting the fire. Chen was pulling shells away from the flames with bare hands, skin already blistering. Rodriguez stayed at the controls, ready to drive if ordered. Walsh clutched his radio, transmitting their position to command like protocol demanded, even as the tank became a death trap. Hayes grabbed Miller by the collar and shoved him toward the turret hatch. "That's an order, Sergeant! Get out!" Miller's face was black with smoke, eyes wild. "Not without you, Lieutenant. I'm right behind you. Move." It was a lie. Hayes had no intention of leaving, because through the smoke and flames, through the vision blocks that were rapidly obscuring, he could see what his crew couldn't. 5 German panzer tanks advancing on American infantry positions 200 yards ahead. Infantry with no anti-tank weapons, no cover, no chance against armor. If those panzers reached them, 40 men would die. But if a burning Sherman tank already lost, already doomed, could ram even 1 panzer, could create chaos, could buy 30 seconds for infantry to retreat, then 5 deaths became 40 lives saved. Except Hayes wasn't planning to let 5 men die. He was planning to let 1 die. Himself. This is the story of the 70 seconds when a high school history teacher turned tank commander committed the act the Army would call abandonment of duty. The 70 seconds when he ordered his crew to safety, stayed behind in a burning tank, and drove into 5 German panzers, knowing the explosion would kill him. The 70 seconds that saved his crew and 40 infantry, but earned him a posthumous court-martial for cowardice. Before we go further, if you believe the line between abandoning your men and saving them can be the same action viewed from different angles, hit that subscribe button. This is the story they tried to court-martial after the hero was already dead. Hayes had 45 seconds left. The fire had reached the first ammunition rack. Small arms rounds were cooking off, popping like firecrackers inside the turret. Any second now, the 75mm shells would go, and Fury Road would become a coffin. "Miller, Rodriguez, Chen, Walsh, that's an order from your commanding officer. Abandon tank, now." Hayes's voice carried the authority of 18 months commanding these men, of keeping them alive when other tank crews died, of being the teacher who protected his students even when the classroom was a steel box in a frozen forest. Miller hesitated, torn between following orders and abandoning his lieutenant. Hayes didn't give him the choice. He physically shoved Miller toward the hatch, then grabbed Rodriguez. "Get them out. That's your last order from me." Something in Hayes' voice, finality perhaps, or the absolute certainty of a man who'd already accepted his death, broke through their resistance. Miller scrambled through the turret hatch. Chen followed. Rodriguez and Walsh went through the hull escape hatch, tumbling into Belgian snow. Hayes was alone in Fury Road, with 30 seconds until the ammunition exploded. Through the smoke, he could see the German panzers still advancing. 40 Americans about to die unless someone stopped those tanks. David Hayes, who'd taught American history to Boston teenagers about men who'd sacrificed everything for their brothers, released the brake and aimed his burning tomb at the enemy. David Hayes had never wanted to be a soldier. Before Pearl Harbor, his battlefield was a classroom at Dorchester High School in Boston, where he taught American history to teenagers who thought the Revolutionary War was boring and World War I was ancient history. He was 31 years old when Japan bombed Hawaii, married to a woman named Catherine, already planning to apply for the principal's position that would open in 1943. Teaching had always been more than a job for Hayes. It was a calling inherited from his father, who'd taught mathematics for 40 years in the same school district. "You don't teach subjects," his father had said. "You teach children. The subject is just the vehicle." David had absorbed that lesson completely. He didn't teach history. He taught students to think critically about the past so they could navigate the future. Some teachers kept professional distance. Hayes learned every student's name, their struggles, their potential. When the draft notice came in February 1942, Catherine cried. David held her and promised he'd come home, but he'd also felt something unexpected: relief. For months after Pearl Harbor, he'd been teaching about American sacrifice, Valley Forge, Gettysburg, the Argonne, while young men he'd taught the previous year were enlisting. The disconnect had become unbearable. How could he teach history's lessons about duty while avoiding the war that would define his generation? He reported to Fort Knox for armored training. The Army tested his leadership skills, saw his teaching background, and assigned him to Tank Commander School. Tanks required crews who functioned as single units, where the commander was part leader, part teacher, part parent. Someone who could train men under pressure, maintain discipline without breaking morale, make split-second decisions that kept 4 other men alive. David Hayes had spent 10 years doing exactly that in classrooms where the stakes were grades instead of lives. His crew came together at Fort Knox in May 1942. Sergeant Thomas Miller from Ohio, gunner, quiet and methodical. Private First Class Miguel Rodriguez from Texas, driver, quick reflexes and quicker smile. Private James Chen from California, loader, strongest man Hayes had ever met. Private Patrick Walsh from Brooklyn, radio operator, never stopped talking. 4 men from different backgrounds, different ages, different everything except that they'd been assigned to the same Sherman tank under a commander who'd never fired a shot in anger. Hayes trained them the way he'd taught students, patiently, repeatedly, never assuming they knew something until he'd confirmed it. He learned their backgrounds, their families, their fears. Miller had a fiancée in Cleveland. Rodriguez sent half his pay home to his mother. Chen's parents were in an internment camp in Arizona. He'd enlisted anyway to prove loyalty. Walsh had 3 younger sisters depending on his army pay. They shipped to England in October 1943, crossed into France after D-Day, fought through hedgerows and forests and frozen Belgian winter. Other tank crews came and went. Casualties, transfers, breakdowns. Fury Road stayed intact. Hayes kept them alive through 6 months of combat by treating them like students he was responsible for protecting. He took the most dangerous positions. He made decisions that prioritized crew survival over tactical glory. Other commanders accused him of being too cautious, too protective. Hayes didn't care. His job wasn't winning medals. His job was bringing 4 men home alive. By January 1945, they functioned like one organism. Miller anticipated Hayes's targeting orders before he spoke them. Rodriguez knew which terrain Hayes would choose without needing directions. Chen loaded ammunition with the rhythm of someone who'd done it 5,000 times. Walsh transmitted reports in the clipped, efficient language of a crew that trusted their commander absolutely. They trusted him to keep them alive. And on January 10, 1945, David Hayes honored that trust by ordering them out of a burning tank while he stayed inside alone. The teacher protecting his students one final time, using the only weapon he had left, his own death. 70 seconds alone. That's how long David Hayes had from the moment Walsh tumbled through the hull escape hatch to the moment Fury Road exploded. 70 seconds to cross 200 yards of frozen Belgian terrain, aim a burning Sherman at 5 German panzers, and die in a way that might save 40 American infantry. Second one. Hayes released the parking brake and grabbed the hull controls. Rodriguez had already abandoned the driver's position, so Hayes had to operate both commander and driver functions simultaneously. The Sherman lurched forward, suspension groaning under 40 tons of steel and fire. Smoke filled the crew compartment so thick Hayes could barely see the vision blocks. He navigated by memory and instinct, the way a teacher navigates a darkened classroom after years of walking the same aisles. Second 15. Ammunition was cooking off continuously now, 30 caliber rounds popping like firecrackers, sending shrapnel ricocheting inside the turret. Hayes felt something hot punch through his left shoulder. Didn't know if it was shrapnel or burning metal, didn't matter. Pain was information he couldn't use. He kept the throttle pressed, Sherman engine roaring, treads chewing frozen mud. Second 23. Through the smoke and flames, Hayes saw the lead German panzer. Bigger than a Sherman, better armored, 75mm gun that could penetrate American armor from 1,000 yards. Under normal circumstances, Fury Road would be outmatched, outgunned, destroyed. But these weren't normal circumstances. Hayes wasn't trying to win a tank duel. He was trying to be a missile, a guided bomb, a suicide weapon aimed at maximum disruption. Second 35. The heat was unbearable now. Hayes's uniform was smoking, skin blistering where flames touched exposed flesh. He thought about Catherine, about the letter he'd written 2 days ago that would reach her after he was dead. He'd told her about his crew, about how proud he was that they'd survived this long. He hadn't told her he was planning to die for them because he hadn't been planning it. This decision had formed in the seconds after the Panzerfaust hit, crystallized in the moment he saw those 5 panzers advancing toward men who couldn't defend themselves. Second 47. The 75mm shells were heating up, expanding in their casings. Hayes knew the physics overpressure would rupture the shell casing, ignite the propellant, detonate the high explosive. When that happened, the 40 rounds stored beside the main gun would explode simultaneously with enough force to turn Fury Road into shrapnel. The question wasn't if it would happen, but when, and whether Hayes could reach the panzers before it did. Second 52. He could see German tank crews now, visible through their turret hatches, confused by the burning Sherman driving straight at them instead of retreating. One panzer's gun traversed toward Fury Road too slow, the German gunner not understanding that Hayes wasn't attacking. He was already dead, just using his corpse's momentum to crash into them. Second 61. Hayes thought about his students at Dorchester High, about teaching them Valley Forge, explaining how Washington's army had endured winter that should have destroyed them, about the lesson he'd tried to convey, that history was made by ordinary people choosing extraordinary sacrifice. He'd never imagined he'd become the lesson. Second 68. Impact. Fury Road. Crashed into the lead panzer at 15 miles per hour. Not fast enough to penetrate armor, but fast enough to tangle treads, to lock the two tanks together in mechanical embrace. Hayes felt the collision through his bones, felt ribs crack from the deceleration. Second 70. The ammunition detonated. David Hayes, who'd taught history for 10 years and made it for 70 seconds, vanished in an explosion that destroyed 5 German panzers, saved 40 American infantry, and started a court-martial that would last longer than his final moments alive. His crew watched from 200 yards away. Miller collapsed into Belgian snow, sobbing. Rodriguez made the sign of the cross. Chen stood motionless, comprehending sacrifice he couldn't process. Walsh kept transmitting into his radio long after there was anything left to report. Fury Road destroyed. Commander killed in action. Enemy armor eliminated. The Army would later call what Hayes did abandonment of command. His crew would call it salvation. History would need 33 years to decide which was true. The explosion lit the Belgian forest like a second sunrise. 5 German panzers destroyed in the chain reaction, Hayes's Sherman detonating first, igniting the lead panzer's ammunition, which detonated the second, then third, creating a cascade of fire that consumed all 5 tanks in under 10 seconds. German tank crews who escaped burned or died from shrapnel. The 40 American infantry Hayes had been protecting watched from their positions, not understanding what they'd just witnessed. Miller understood. He'd been with Hayes for 30 months, knew how the lieutenant thought, how he calculated odds, how he valued crew survival above everything. When Hayes ordered them to bail, Miller had thought it was standard procedure. Get clear, regroup, report the loss. But watching Fury Road accelerate toward enemy armor instead of away from it, Miller realized the truth. Hayes hadn't been planning to follow them out. He'd lied to make them leave. He stayed, Miller said, voice hollow. He made us bail, and he stayed. Rodriguez was still catching his breath from the sprint away from the tank. Maybe he couldn't get out in time. He didn't try. Miller's hands shook. He ordered us out, then drove straight at those panzers. He was already dead. He just used the tank as a weapon. Chen sat in the snow, burns on his hands from handling hot ammunition shells. He saved us. He abandoned us. Walsh said quietly, "That's what command will say. Commander's supposed to be last out, not force the crew to leave while he stays." The words hung in frozen air. Military protocol was explicit. Tank commanders evacuated last, ensuring crew safety before their own. Hayes had done the opposite, forced his crew to safety while remaining in a burning tank. The fact that he'd used those final seconds to destroy enemy armor didn't change the order of events. He'd abandoned his command position. He'd violated protocol. The reasons why wouldn't matter to investigators reading reports. Captain Morrison arrived 30 minutes later with recovery units. He surveyed the Destruction 6 burned tanks, German and American, twisted metal cooling in Belgian winter. "Where's Lieutenant Hayes?" Miller gestured at the wreckage. "In there, sir. He stayed in the tank after ordering us to evacuate. Drove it into the panzers." Morrison's expression shifted. "He stayed inside after ordering evacuation?" "Yes, sir. He saved us. And those infantry." Miller pointed to the American soldiers who were repositioning, alive because 5 panzers had been destroyed before reaching them. "I'm sure he did, Sergeant." Morrison's voice carried something Miller didn't like. Not grief. Calculation. But he also violated standing orders about evacuation protocol. "I'll need written statements from all of you." Over the following days, Miller and the crew gave their statements. They described the Panzerfaust hit, the fire, Hayes ordering them to evacuate, Hayes remaining inside to destroy enemy armor. They thought they were documenting heroism. They didn't understand they were building a court-martial case. The preliminary report came January 18th. Miller saw it on Morrison's desk. Lieutenant David Hayes, abandonment of command position, unauthorized action, resulting in destruction of Army property. The language was cold, procedural, wrong. Hayes had died saving 40 men. The Army was treating it like property damage and dereliction of duty. "This is insane," Miller told Morrison. "He's dead. He died a hero." "He died in violation of standing orders," Morrison said. "Commander evacuates last. Hayes forced his crew out, then stayed behind without authorization. That's abandonment. He destroyed 5 panzers, with a tank that should have been evacuated and preserved for recovery. Lieutenant Hayes made an unauthorized tactical decision that resulted in Army property destruction and his own unnecessary death." Miller felt something break inside him. Unnecessary? Those panzers would have killed 40 infantry. That's speculation. What's fact is Hayes violated protocol. Morrison's expression was sympathetic but firm. "I don't write the regulations, Sergeant. I enforce them. The Army is considering posthumous court-martial proceedings." Posthumous court-martial. They were going to try a dead hero for the crime of saving his crew and 40 other men. Miller walked out of Morrison's office understanding that the same Army Hayes died protecting was about to destroy his name. He wrote to Catherine Hayes that night, started with condolences, ended with a promise. "Your husband saved my life. If they try to call him a coward, I'll fight them until my last breath." It was a promise that would take 33 years to fulfill. The court-martial convened on February 3, 1945, in a Belgian schoolhouse that still smelled of chalk and children. 3 officers sat in judgment of a dead man, Major Phillips presiding, the same officer who'd convicted Nathan Cross for shooting a medic 3 weeks earlier. The Army had a reputation to protect. Rules existed for reasons, and heroes who violated them were still violators. Catherine Hayes sat in the front row, 7 months pregnant with a daughter who would never meet her father. She'd traveled from Boston on a military transport, determined to defend a husband who couldn't defend himself. Beside her sat Miller, Rodriguez, Chen, and Walsh Hayes' crew, wearing dress uniforms they'd borrowed because their combat gear was still covered in Belgian mud. The prosecution was led by Captain Anderson, the same JAG officer who'd convicted Tommy Reeves for desertion. Anderson stood before the court with Hayes' service record. "Gentlemen, the facts are undisputed. On January 10th, Lieutenant Hayes ordered his crew to evacuate a damaged tank, then remained inside in violation of standing evacuation protocols. Army Regulation 850-20 is explicit. Tank commanders evacuate last, ensuring crew safety before their own. Lieutenant Hayes did the opposite. Anderson presented the crew's own statements as evidence, their descriptions of Hayes ordering them out, physically forcing them through hatches, staying behind alone. These statements confirm Lieutenant Hayes abandoned his command position. The fact that he subsequently used the tank to attack enemy armor doesn't erase the abandonment. It compounds it with unauthorized tactical action and willful destruction of Army property valued at $50,000. Catherine's attorney, a Boston lawyer named Brennan who'd volunteered his services, stood for the defense. Lieutenant Hayes saved his entire crew and 40 infantry soldiers. His actions destroyed 5 enemy tanks. This wasn't abandonment. This was battlefield heroism. Heroism that violated explicit protocol, Anderson countered. If we excuse this, we tell every tank commander that protocols are optional, that they can decide unilaterally to sacrifice themselves and Army equipment based on tactical judgment we haven't authorized them to make. Miller was called to testify. He stood at attention, jaw tight. Lieutenant Hayes was the best commander I ever served under. He kept us alive for 6 months when other crews died. On January 10th, he saved our lives by making us leave. By abandoning his command position, Anderson said. By protecting his crew, sir. Protocol requires commanders evacuate last, Sergeant. Do you dispute that Lieutenant Hayes violated this protocol? Miller's hands clenched. He followed a higher protocol, sir. He kept his men alive. That's not your decision to make. Or his. Anderson turned to the court. Lieutenant Hayes had 30 seconds to evacuate with his crew. Instead, he chose to remain inside and conduct an unauthorized attack. That decision cost the Army a tank and an officer. The tactical result, enemy tanks destroyed, doesn't justify the violation. Catherine took the stand next, reading from a letter Hayes had written days before his death. He wrote, "I'm proudest that my crew is still alive. Other commanders lose men. I've lost equipment, dignity, respect from other officers who think I'm too cautious. But Miller, Rodriguez, Chen and Walsh are still breathing. That's the only metric that matters to me." Her voice broke. "My husband died protecting his students, because that's what they were to him. Not just soldier students he was responsible for keeping alive." Major Phillips listened without expression. When testimony concluded, the court deliberated for 20 minutes. Phillips read the verdict. Lieutenant David Hayes is found guilty posthumously of abandonment of command position and unauthorized destruction of Army property. Recommended sentence: no burial at Arlington National Cemetery, no military honors, dishonorable discharge noted in service record. Catherine stood, chair scraping against wood floor. "You're convicting a dead hero for saving lives. We're upholding regulations that prevent chaos," Phillips said quietly. "Lieutenant Hayes violated clear protocols. His tactical success doesn't change that. This court is adjourned." Miller watched them leave, watched Catherine collapse in grief, watched the Army erase a hero because he'd valued lives over rules. Outside, American soldiers advanced through Belgian forest, alive because Hayes had destroyed 5 panzers. None of them knew they'd been saved by a man the Army had just convicted of cowardice. David Hayes was buried in a civilian cemetery outside Boston on February 12, 1945, with no military honors. Catherine stood beside the grave, 7 months pregnant, watching them lower a coffin the Army refused to drape with an American flag. Miller, Rodriguez, Chen, and Walsh attended in civilian clothes. The Army had denied them permission to wear dress uniforms at the burial of a dishonorably discharged officer. Catherine gave birth to Margaret Hayes in April, a daughter who would grow up with photographs of a father the government called a coward. Catherine never remarried, never stopped fighting. She wrote to senators, congressmen, the War Department. Every letter said the same thing. "My husband died saving lives. Your verdict makes him a criminal." Miller returned to Ohio, to the fiancée who'd waited 3 years. But he couldn't let it go. He organized Hayes's crew annual reunions where they'd drink and remember the lieutenant who'd kept them alive. Every year they'd pool money and hire lawyers to petition the Army to overturn Hayes's conviction. Every year the Army denied the appeal. The verdict was legally sound based on regulations in effect at the time. The years accumulated. Catherine raised Margaret alone, working as a secretary, never letting her daughter forget what her father had done. Miller worked at a Ford plant. Rodriguez opened a garage in Texas. Chen became a teacher in California. Walsh drove a truck in New York. 4 men living ordinary lives, bound by the memory of 70 seconds when their commander chose their survival over his own. In 1975, a Vietnam veteran named Coleman began researching posthumous court-martials for his graduate thesis. He found Hayes's case, the only instance where the Army had court-martialed a dead Medal of Honor-worthy action as abandonment. Coleman wrote an exposé in Military Review magazine, "The Army That Eats Its Heroes." Veteran groups seized the story. VFW chapters across America demanded review. Miller, now 65, testified before a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing. Lieutenant Hayes ordered us to live. Then he showed us how to die. The Army convicted him for it. The pressure mounted. In 1978, 33 years after Hayes's death, the Army quietly overturned the conviction. Based on review of combat circumstances and tactical outcomes, Lieutenant David Hayes's actions are retroactively classified as consistent with command responsibilities under extreme duress. No apology, just bureaucratic acknowledgement they'd been wrong for 3 decades. Catherine was 72, dying of cancer. The Army arranged reburial at Arlington with full military honors. Margaret Hayes, 33 years old, stood where her mother had stood in 1945, watching them lower her father's coffin again, this time under an American flag, this time with a 3-volley salute. Miller gave the eulogy, voice breaking. Lieutenant Hayes taught American history at Dorchester High School. Then on January 10, 1945, he became it. He taught us that some sacrifices are worth making even when regulations say they're crimes. He protected his students one last time, and we spent 33 years proving he was right. Rodriguez, Chen, and Walsh stood at attention, old men now, crying openly. 4 students whose teacher had saved them by making them leave, then used his death as the final lesson. If this story breaks your heart the way it should, subscribe. Because the heroes who sacrifice everything don't always get remembered. Sometimes they get court-martialed, and sometimes it takes 33 years for the truth to matter more than the regulations. David Hayes died in 70 seconds and was convicted for 33 years. But his crew never forgot. His daughter never surrendered. And eventually, the Army ran out of ways to justify calling courage a crime. At Arlington, they placed Hayes's headstone near other tank commanders who died in World War II. The inscription reads, First Lieutenant David Hayes, 1913-1945. He taught history. Then he became it. Miller visited that grave every year until he died in 1989. Every visit, he'd say the same thing. You were right, Lieutenant. We made it home.